Welcome back to General Ecology and Competition. For someone who has such a love-hate relationship with this topic, I certainly seem to enjoy talking about it. It's an interesting topic. I think it's overblown. I've highlighted that. But I'll come back to that a little bit later when we get into other species interactions in later chapters, and I emphasize how that changes and a little bit today. So to kind of summarize a little bit what we were just talking about already and to lead into where we're headed, coexistence is out there. It's not supported with the simplified Lotka-Volterra modeling for competition or anything else, because those models don't incorporate the grand reality of all the other things that are happening to those two species. Yes, they might fluctuate, right, over time with predator-prey or even competition. One will win, one won't. And then there's a lot of time spent modeling to demonstrate that coexistence can be modeled with these. I'm not all that intrigued with that idea. I think it's interesting, it's fun, but it doesn't really tell us what's really going on, maybe an isolated sort of null hypothesis setting. So I shouldn't poo-poo it too much, but I'm more interested in where we're headed with species interactions and community dynamics. But looking at competition and what allows coexistence, I've already talked about that first line there, that shifting limitations of resources allows for competition to be sort of attenuated, that one species might be really good at getting nitrogen, the other one better at getting phosphorus, and through time, they each get the upper hand over time in a setting. Or for the aquatic systems and those diatoms, the silica and the phosphorus. Both, if you go out and sample, you'll probably see both in the aquatic system. I won't say those names again, but the phosphorus lover and the silicon lover. But at any one time, there's going to be more silica to drive the system to allow that one to survive better and reproduce better. The other one takes a hit, but it doesn't disappear. And then something happens where phosphorus becomes more common. Did I start with silica and go to phosphorus? You get the point. So shifting limitations of resources, and Liebig's barrel is an interesting way of looking at it. Multiple element limitations, nutrient elements. There's some very interesting research by Ruthie and I going on in the White Mountains, looking at multiple element limitations. Okay, she's not alone. There are many. External factors is another issue that support coexistence. I've been hinting at it a lot. Things like a harsh environment can push a species down and allow another species to dominate for a while. Predators and herbivores obviously impact each other's or their prey's presence, and switching preys, you'll see in a minute, will impact coexistence. Won't let one predator or prey dominate, because they're always getting knocked back. If you get to be too abundant, you are the target for the predator, and it knocks you down. Same with grasses and herbs. You'll be eaten if there's more of you, until there's less of you, and then whatever has taken back over then becomes the one that is getting knocked back, and you have been released to continue to grow. And then disturbance is one of my favorites. That is what, in addition to my interest in mycology and mycorrhizal fungi, my other big interest is disturbance. And that probably has to do with growing up in earthquake country, which is, plants don't care. I've seen earthquakes and the trees go, whatever. Meanwhile, human structures collapse. So that's an interesting idea, but it certainly impacted me. Where I'm actually more interested in the ecology is fire, right? Fire as a disturbance, and what plants can handle, what animals can handle the sweeping through of a fire, and how do they handle it, and what does that do to their dominance in the system. So let's look at a couple of those. The second stuff here. We already did the limitation of resources. Today we're going to talk about this portion down here. So back to Joseph Connell. We've already heard a little bit about him. Here he looked at barnacles and mussels and things like that on the intertidal zone on the Pacific Ocean and maybe the Atlantic in Scotland, as I said. So in this case, the resource is space. So if you're a barnacle larva, you're pelagic, you're floating around, and you land here, there's a lot of competition. There's a lot of your brethren or even other species. You're not going to get established. But if you land right there, that's an empty piece of rock. Now you can get established. So space is a hugely important resource. Then disturbance comes into play, environmental constraints. Because if you are up here, there's going to be more space higher up on the intertidal zone because logs are washing in with the tide and banging into the rock where it's higher and knocking barnacles and mussels and other things off. And that leaves that empty space for you to get established, but it also leaves you now exposed to the same disturbance. As well, you're high enough that the water is not always present, and it starts to dry out, and the salt concentration goes up. And so you have desiccation as a major disturbance at the high intertidal zone versus the low. So at low, lots of competition, lots of crowding, less desiccation. At high intertidal, less crowding, but then harsher environment, right? This is all from Joseph Connell, some beautiful experiments. And actually, this is a schematic of his work. And we have two different barnacle species. One's called Poley's stellate barnacle, and the other's called the rock barnacle. And as you can see, the Poley's stellate barnacle is dominant up at the top. So it handles desiccation and bumping by logs and all of that. It actually gets established down here if it can, all right? The pelagic nature of their larvae will float throughout, down into the lower intertidal. But even if it gets established, the rock barnacle has this ability to actually grow under the shell of the Poley's and pop it off. So when it comes in contact, like these guys here are probably going to get knocked off by competition, physical competition with the rock barnacle, and it's going to knock them off at this sort of no man's zone right here, although the rock barnacle is saying, no, it's mine, okay? Up here, if that rock barnacle gets established, and some do, as soon as there's a high tide, or excuse me, a low tide, they dry out, get too salty, and they're going to lose up here. So they've sort of, is that goes to competition past? It's a good just so story. There is a superior competitor. I would argue Poley's is a superior competitor. Its competition, its superpower is handling desiccation and salt and maybe getting knocked off by logs. The superpower of rock barnacle is it can't handle that, but boy, can it go over and knock you off if you're right next to it with its ability to get under your skin, or I should say shell, and pop you off. So this leads to coexistence. However, there is a separation in space, right? And at multiple scales, this is always happening. And you may look at an interaction and say, boy, there's a lot of species here. They must all live together happily or not. But in fact, if you drill down, you'd find out that they are separate in space or time. They're getting established at different times. A variety of factors that you have to pay attention to your scale of interaction to really start seeing how things are behaving to allowing that coexistence to occur. Okay, here's another variation on the intertidal zone storyline. So as it turns out, sea stars are rather brutal. They're very hungry, and they just basically can make their way around a mussel or other bivalve. They exude out their stomach. It's not gross. It looks kind of funky, but it's not gross. They take in the mussel You get their stomach all the way around that muscle, and then they just start sucking and sucking hard. And you would not imagine, if you've ever tried to open a muscle, you would not imagine that a sea star with its little flimsy kind of gelatinous stomach can get enough pressure and vacuum to pull the guts out of that mussel shell, but it does. And so it can, these sea stars, some of them are voracious, the stellates, what are they called? I forget what they're called. I'll come back with that maybe. But they will wipe out an entire bed of mussels. And it's pretty impressive. When they do, there's an example, things like barnacles, where it was just a pure bed of mussels, once the sea stars get in there, now you've got all sorts of open space, and barnacles can get established and lots of other things. Limpets can get established and other things, right? So what was once a pure black bed of mussels now becomes a rather diverse group, all because of the disturbance that these sea stars have imposed. They're predators, but it's still a disturbance, at least to the mussel. I believe they do eat things like barnacles and such, but their preferred meaty habit is, or meal is are the mussels. And here's like a phalanx of sea stars heading in and taking out the mussels. You wouldn't think of it. You know, when you see that bed of mussels, they look pretty stable, but they are not. Here's an example that looks at the same kind of phenomena. In this case, you have the predators, which is a newt, coexistence. The predators increase the diversity of the frogs. The newts are voracious. They love to eat what do we call these now? I am not an amphibianologist by trade. It's more by kid habit. But I used to call them polywogs. I think they're called tadpoles now. I don't know. Anyway, there's 3 different ones. If there are no predatory newts in the pond, the spadefoot toad wins, and it becomes very quickly close to and will become 100% spadefoot toad, which those of you who know your toads know which one that is. Maybe this one or this one. These are the 2 toads. Okay, if you add 2 predatory newts, you could see that they seem to like those toads, or at least their larvae, the polywogs. And so they got knocked down to 60% of the numbers, and or survival. And now this little spring peeper, which was not doing real well in the absence of the newt, starts to kick in. And then if you get up to 8, you have a very nice, diverse pond with almost equal representation of all 3 of these species, all because of that little dude, a voracious polywog eater. Okay, tadpole eater, sorry. This, of course, is the spring peeper. Rarely, from personal experience, is that X on the back so clear. Everybody's like, oh yeah, you can tell, just look for the X. Okay, not always so clear. I'll just leave it at that. All right, so predator as disturbance, and that predator actually is increasing or supporting a greater diversity of toads and frogs in this particular pond or in ponds. Okay, another big one on competition, just general disturbances like fire, like ice storms, floods, drought, predators we've just been talking about, insect pests, fungal pathogens, bacterial pathogens, viruses, general epidemics, all knock dominant species back. What are good examples of dominant species right now where there's epidemics happening? Human, maybe, with the virus, or variety of viruses like West Nile and others. Obviously, COVID is what I'm thinking about. What about fungal pathogens and insects? If we push the system too far, are we looking at a whole lot of ash trees out there and suddenly it's a salad bar for the emerald ash borer? Boom, now we've got an epidemic. Fungal pathogens and insects? How about chestnut blight? How about beach bark disease? right? These things are knocking the dominant species back, and we're going to get a greater diversity as a result of that. And it's just part of the ecological cycling and dynamics that occur out there. And it helps to keep those kinds of things in mind. Also, those eucalyptus become dominant. My chaparral species out in California, their leaves also are very oily and generate fire. Once you get a fire started, it's off and running. Closed cone pine, same thing, lots of dead wood. So those conditions, though, after the disturbance, support coexistence. Those species that are able to reestablish after the disturbance become dominant for a while, and slowly the community returns back to what it was prior to the disturbance, and in the process there's a greater coexistence. And no, they're not all getting along. Yes, they can be found at the same place at the same time. No, it's not a good idea to make up stories to say that they're all sharing and it's the 60s all over again in San Francisco. Sorry, you'll hear that again. Okay, so recall that we had lots of species on multiple species, lots of slides on multiple species and multiple resources. And I think this is those resource ideas, that's the essence of what I like to call niche partitioning. There's a lot of things, a lot of resources out there, and any one species is or can become an expert on one of those resources, and that's its kind of niche, right? And it can outcompete others because it's honed in on that particular resource. And it partitions. Some species go this way, some species go that way. So let's say nitrogen lovers, phosphorus lovers, water lovers, disturbance survival lovers, etc. A lot of niches out there, a lot of species, a lot of coexistence. And I joke with my students in my lab and some of the other upper division courses that we call this multi-dimensional niche space. So there are a lot of dimensions here, there is the vector of the nitrogen and the phosphorus and the calcium and the water. And I'm thinking in a plant fungal world here, but I'm sure you could do the same with your animal world. A lot of niches, multi-dimensional niche space, a lot of species. Why? Because of all that niche space and the variation within it. And then there's also, if I haven't made it perfectly clear, the disturbance. Disturbance removes the dominant species at a location. That allows less dominant species to become dominant and to thrive until a disturbance comes along and knocks that one out. Okay. Some interesting theories beyond that. I may get into the Hubble's null model for why there are so many tree species in the tropics that don't really use either one of these, but we'll come there if I do in a later lecture. Okay, you could look it up though, Hubble null model. And he worked on Barro, Colorado, which is an island in the Panama Canal. Lots of good research. Okay, now let's look at the population growth models reviewed. This is the last, second to last slide in today's lecture and the chapter. And what you're seeing here are the Lotka-Volterra carrying capacity part of competition models. Okay, so in Lotka-Volterra it'd be 1 minus n over k, n1 over k1. But in a competition model, we add the competition of species 2 on the carrying capacity, so to speak, of species 1, and vice versa for species 2. I'm going to come back to that in the next lecture and actually write the rest of the equation out. I can't believe I left that out. But we'll fix that. You can do it as a test and see if you can't come up with the rest of the equation there. Okay? dNTT equals dNTT for species 1 and species 2, but what's missing? Okay, this is not one equation, these are two separate equations. All right, and I'll come in with those built-up models next time. But look what we've been doing. So we started with geometric growth, n over t, so the population at some time in the future is equal to population today times the geometric growth rate, lambda, times the number of generations we're looking at, t, or raised to the number of generations that we're looking at t. Okay, remember that equation way back when? And then we had another one for the exponential growth. NT equals the population today times E raised to the RT. Okay, the E raised to the RT, the natural log, raised to the rate of growth times the time that you're looking at. Here was the exponential growth equation. Rearranging that, d into t equals r, the rate of growth times n, today's population. You could see where this population is going. And then Lotka-Volterra get in there and write one for the prey. Their consumption removal by the consumption by predators, so there's a negative component added to the exponential growth rate. That's for the prey. And the predator has, instead of R, its ability to capture and assimilate the prey, N, into predator bodies, minus the death of the predators, mortality of the predators. Okay, so those are the prey and predator equations that we've looked at. And then the logistic equation, so rate of growth times the population, and then there's the carrying capacity element, so crowding and things like that that reduce the rate of growth. Okay, when the population starts approaching calcium. That would be potassium anyway, it's not Ca, it's K. Approaches carrying capacity. Now, this is what we need to do. We need to fix these two competition models to include Rn. R1, N1, R2, N2, and they're two separate equations. Don't think that this is the same thing. But again, I'll make sure that's clear in the next lecture. So those are our competition equations. On an exam, you might see all of these, and I'm going to ask you to tell me which one's the Lotka-Volterra equation for prey. Which one shows population growth following a geometric growth model? Which one shows how to calculate population growth with competition in a second species? What does beta mean? What does alpha mean? So I'm not asking you to plug in the numbers and to crank out the data. I'm asking you to know what the equations are telling you, okay? Or the variables. Certain amount of variation, certain amount of memorization, I am sorry. But that is the way it's going to have to be, okay? You don't use the equations, but you might see them on, say, a multiple choice question, and there's going to be all of those equations available for you to choose when I ask which one's the exponential growth equation. Okay? All right. And the last item then is a general review of what we've been looking at in the competition chapter. It occurs when individuals experience limited resources. You could have renewable and non-renewable. There is a theory of competition that leads to, that basically is just the extension of the logistic growth models, the mathematical theory behind it. A bit simplified. Competition can be intra and interspecific, know the difference. Competition can occur through exploitation or direct interference, and I like my Halloween candy example to know the difference. The outcome of competition can be altered by abiotic conditions, different nutrient levels, different resource levels, disturbances, and interactions with other species. And finally, my little tagline here is that competition is pervasive. It's always going on, but I don't think it dominates species interactions the way ecology has led us to believe. I will throw out one name that would disagree with me. Fair enough. A guy named Tillman. He's all about resources and competition and has done a very good job with his modeling of that, but still has not come up with a good model that supports the, as I understand, supports the idea of coexistence as driven perhaps by mutualistic interactions. It's still a dog-eat-dog world, and it's legit, maybe, but it's far more legit with mathematical models than I think it is with organisms in the real world. So I may just have got myself into some trouble there. So it goes. In the next section, we're moving in to mutualisms. So I hope you look at that chapter and look at all the variations. Just as a point of reference, the old ecology textbooks would say that mutualisms are special cases, right? They're not stable. You can find them, and those species can maintain a presence on the landscape, so clownfish and their anemones, but that's a special case, okay? And wasps and figs, that's a special case. Many other things. However, I'm not sure that is doing it a just service, because you all have mitochondria in your cells. Now, I'm not saying the mitochondria are doing it for you, nor you helping them. It's just that there is a mutualistic interaction there, and their fitness is increasing because of that interaction. It's not competition keeping one down and releasing the other one, okay? They're supporting each other, and you can't model that, as far as I understand. What's another good example? Mitochondria. Dare I say rhizobia or mycorrhizal fungi, dare I say lichens. This is all over the planet. These are not special cases. And I think we would do a lot better with our understanding of populations and community dynamics if we stop rejecting it as an important factor in species interactions. So with that, back off of my soapbox. I've been on a couple today. We'll see you for the next segment on mutualisms next time. Cheers.